This is the third in the series of vlogs on vocabulary teaching, and this is about a glossary for vocabulary teaching. We decided to develop a glossary for teachers to better understand the terminology related to vocabulary teaching, so that when you're selecting words and being intentional about the words that you teach, you'll have a sense of why and what you will do. So we couch all of this under the umbrella of academic vocabulary, which includes both the domain-specific vocabulary found in the content areas, as well as the more generic academic vocabulary that we see across the content areas. Essentially, the general academic vocabulary is often considered the mortar that holds domain-specific vocabulary and concepts together. Often those words are really hard to define. So if you think about the words analysis, similar, compare, those are words that are conceptually understandable, but maybe not easy to define in the context of the classroom. So experts in this area, including Baer and Beck and others, suggest that rather than attempting to find those precise definitions, we instead use those terms repeatedly in meaningful context, help children understand what functions those words serve, and increase exposure to word families, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. So within this umbrella of academic vocabulary are the tier 1, 2, and 3 words that we've already talked about in previous blogs. So tier 1 being those very familiar words that generally require little instruction. Tier 2 words are words that appear frequently in a wide variety of text and across content areas. So those words like analysis, similar, compare, those would be considered tier 2 words. And then those tier 3 domain-specific words, the ones that we find in service of particular content areas. So a term that we should be familiar with is etymology, which is the study of the origin and historical development of words. Etymon comes from a Greek root, which means true sense or original meaning, and logi comes from the study of or the speaking of. So this word together means that we are studying the true sense or original meaning, and in this case of words. So it's developed over time to mean that. And it's important to understand the origin and historical development of words because it's those different parts of words that allow us to understand other words. So if I understand logi and the fact that it is the study of or the speaking of, then when I hear the word biology or geology, I understand that it is the study of something, and I just need to understand the rest of the word in order to grasp what it is the study of. So Beck and Beck discern that there are 4 components of written English that include phonology, which is the study of sound, orthography, syntax, and semantics. We aren't going to spend time on phonology in this vlog, but instead we'll look at orthography, syntax, and semantics. So ortho also comes from a Greek root, and ortho means correct. Graphy means to write, so this is the correct way to write, which has become synonymous with spelling, essentially. So it's the ways in which letters and patterns in words represent sound and meaning. Often orthography gets confused with decoding, and they actually serve 2 very different purposes. So obviously, reading requires fast and accurate ability to decode words in order to make meaning of the text. Orthography is essential because in order to create text, to be a writer, we need to be able to write fast and accurately in order to make meaning. So orthography and decoding are both essential components of reading and writing, but serve 2 different purposes in those areas. So semantics is the study of meaning. Didn't use that logi root, but it was still the study of meaning. And McCown and her colleagues suggest that there are four components to semantics. So morphology, polysemy, synonyms and antonyms, and homonyms and homophones. There are clearly other components to semantics, but these are the four that we'll talk about in this vlog today. So we'll start with morphology. What we know is that a morph is a form or a shape, and of course we know that the logy is a study of. So this is telling us that we are studying a form or a shape, and in this case we're studying the form or the shape of words and how they're built up from smaller component parts. So what we know is that morphemes are the smallest meaningful unit of language, and morphology is the study of the amalgamation of those units. So while that includes prefixes, roots, and suffixes, research actually tells us that our time is well spent teaching the children as many roots as possible, and that this is essential to broader vocabulary learning. So if we think about the word interpret, if we teach children what it means to interpret, then when they hear words like interpreter, interpretation, misinterpretation, reinterpretation, they understand the base of those words. They understand what it means to interpret. And when we add the at the end, the interpreter, they understand that then the word becomes the agent that interprets, or the person that interprets. And interpretation is a noun, and that's what results by performing the action. So they start to understand, once they understand that root, they can make greater sense of words as they change based on those prefixes and suffixes. Polysemy comes again from Greek, and it means poly means many, and sema means sign. And actually, this comes from the Greek word polysemous, which means of many senses. And actually, the different meanings of words that are polysemous actually are called senses. So these are multiple but related meanings for the same word. So here we have the example bank, and we know of a bank that's connected with money. We know of a bank that's a slope of earth or grass, which is typically near the water. So these actually come from the same root, which means table. And so the bank is it's sort of talking about the physical building, and that you would pass that money across a table. That would be the bank. And then the slope of grass, which is, if you picture a riverbank, kind of a table above the water. So in this case, these two words, although it's the same word, it has multiple meanings. They do come from the same root. So if we think about synonyms and antonyms, these are going to be more familiar to us probably than some of the other terms we've talked about so far. So synonyms are words that mean roughly the same thing. So if we're talking about the word successful and we choose instead the word fortunate, they typically mean the same thing, and we could use them in context in very similar ways. Antonyms, on the other hand, are words that mean the exact opposite, or opposite of each other, probably roughly opposite of each other if we use a similar definition to synonyms. So in this case, if we were using fortunate, we might choose destitute instead. So again, they mean the opposite. All right, so homonyms and homophones. We'll start with homonym. These are words that share the same spelling but have different meanings. And that can be a little confusing because that's essentially the definition of polysemous words. But remember that those polysemous words have to also originate from the same root. So when we talked about the word bank, we talked about the fact that it originated, even though they had two very different meanings, they both originated from the idea of bank as a table. So that's not always the case with homonyms. So the two examples that I have here, skate and address, these don't originate from the same root. So something to think about is that all polysemous words are homonyms, but not all homonyms are polysemous. In terms of teaching, I would probably use the word homonym with children rather than the word polysemy or polysemous. And the reason for that is Really what's important is that they understand that there are words that share spelling but have different meaning. So we can talk to them about the fact that two meanings of a word share the same root, but we don't have to necessarily label that and add to any confusion. So I would suggest using the word homonym if we're going to label this when we're working with children. So here we have two examples: skate. I can skate across the ice, or I might catch a skate, and in that case, I might be meaning a fish. Of course, if you catch a skate on the ice, you're probably going to fall down. That's not good either. Or we can look at the word address. And when we address someone, we speak to them. Or we might be talking about the physical location of a piece of property or something along those lines. If I want to send someone a birthday card, I need to address the envelope with that physical location. So then a homophone, these are words that sound alike, are spelled differently, and have different meanings. So again, if you think about the word phone in here, we know then that it has to do with sound. So examples here are 8 and 8. They sound the same, but we have to understand the meaning that we are attempting to use in order to use the correct spelling of the word to get our meaning across. So sell and write and write. There are so many examples of homophones, and yet another example of why there's such a part of semantics and why understanding the meanings of each of these terms is so essential when we are using our orthographic knowledge and spelling words and producing text. In order to get the meaning that we intend across, it's important that we know the different meanings of these homophones. So syntax are how words are arranged into sentences based on the rules of grammar. This is important because the way we address the rules determine the meaning of our writing. So if you look at the examples here, we can declaratively state, I can go. We can ask the question, can I go? Or if we're Yoda, we can say, go, I can. So that's your Yoda rule. You wouldn't use actually that one because that goes against the rules of grammar and everything but Star Wars. But in the other two examples, these are the same three words. They're three very simple tier 1 words, and yet rearranging them according to the rules actually creates significantly different meaning in what it is we're trying to convey. So I'll leave you with some references. These 4 texts I think are essential reading for considering vocabulary teaching from EYFS through Key Stage 2, or in the US, the elementary grades. The Bear book, Words Their Way, takes us through a trajectory of developmental orthographic knowledge. So how we start to learn from the smallest units, the phonemes and the morphemes, to how we get into understanding the meanings behind those tier 2 and tier 3 words. Beck and Beck, Making Sense of Phonics, really is more of an EYFS Key Stage 1, or I would say the primary grades in the US. This is helping us to think about the ways that we teach children to learn those individual units of sound, those phonemes, and then taking us through decoding words by chunking, segmenting, blending, and some appropriate strategies for doing so. Beck, McCowan, and Kukin, I think, is just an absolutely essential text when considering vocabulary teaching. So bringing words to life not only provides us with the definitions and understanding that back the reasons why we select words we do and the approaches that we take, but also gives us some very practical ways to teach vocabulary in the classroom. And then McCown and her colleagues recently published the vocabulary assessment text, and this extends the work of bringing words to life for teachers to consider how to be responsive in their teaching, so that as you're teaching vocabulary, you've selected the words, you've been very thoughtful about how to teach them, and then what do you do in that moment to understand whether or not the children are grasping the concept of those terms. please reach out to us on Twitter or on our blog with any questions that you have or thoughts that you have, and we will be more than happy to try to address those. So thank you so much.